What's good, YouTube? My name's Matt. I am vegan. I usually go by the moniker plant-based officially because I hate titles and I don't want to be caught in a lie somewhere or my own BS. So I like flying under the radar, but for all intents and purposes, I am vegan. I worked as a zookeeper for a year, full-time, paid. I also have experience at several other zoological and captive animal organizations over the years. That is not the current career path I follow, but it has given me some experience that I think can be valuable to this topic. I watched the Vegan Gains video today where he responded to the controversy surrounding the death of Harambe, the male silverback gorilla that lived at the Cincinnati Zoo until recently. I think he brings up several very cool and interesting points, specifically the contradiction between one animal death and the outcry that is garnered and the lack of outcry over the millions of animals that have been killed as a result of massive animal agriculture across the world. He also asked the question that I think is a good one about whether or not animals, gorillas, exotic animals should be living in downtown Cincinnati, which is a much more complicated topic, and one day I'd like to cover it, but I will not in this video. Vegan Gains poses 3 questions to himself that he uses internet sources and his own reasoning to answer. And my opinion is that they're uninformed, and I think I can offer, and I respect Richard for tackling it. I think he does the best he can. I'd like to offer my response to those 3 questions. Honestly, I'm going to respond to his answers, but we're going to go about it with those 3 questions. The first one that he talks about is how a child could fall over the rail into the moat of a gorilla exhibit at a zoo. And his conclusion is that it's reflective of the failings of the enclosure design and its safety, and also parenting in that situation. And the first thing that it reminds me of is something that one of the first managers I ever worked with said to me. And he said that an animal enclosure has 3 purposes. The first 2 are the most important. Number 1, keep the animals inside. Number 2, keep people out. And number 3, allow people to see the animals. Now, obviously, one of those failed that day. But I think the third one gets lost in this whole thing. Especially as far as zoos are concerned, it's very important. Especially as far as children are concerned, it's very important. Now, one of the zoos I interned at had gorillas. And they offered anyway, several ways to view gorillas. One was through glass, very, very thick glass that a full-size male gorilla could bang up against and not leave a scratch. They also offered something I think is very important, which is the ability to look at a gorilla eye to eye, the ability to see animals without barriers. We don't live in a time anymore where you can look at animals through bars. The public won't stand for that. And you need to offer that kind of connection, especially between animals and kids. And that gets tough. In a zoo season, a big part of their season will be when school groups and summer groups will bring lots of children in to see animals. That's a big part of their outreach in communities and as a business in general. And it's important that kids be able to see those animals eye to eye. So it is a little bit of a balancing act, and it is hard. And you'll get very different opinions from different guests about what is safe and what is not safe. I remember one conversation I had with a woman standing outside the exhibit for a pair of river otters, and there was hot wire separating otters from humans. And her major concern was that the hot wire would not that it would keep the otters out, but that it could hurt her child. My response to that was, we need to keep the animals in, ma'am. And her response was, again, I don't feel comfortable with my child around that. So it is a little bit of balancing act. You'll get guests that feel very different ways about different things you have at the zoo. The reality is we want kids to see them. We want people to be able to see them. But all that being said, I have to recognize that Richard still has a valid point. Is a 3-foot-high railing child-proof? It isn't. But still, I think a point's missed. I don't think it's whether or not the structure of the enclosure failed. In a zoo, when stuff like this happens, it's about the process failing. See, someone like Richard doesn't understand the degrees of separation between this event occurring and not occurring. What stands in the way of a young child doing what happened on that day? The amount of safeguards that exist is great. I think back to something that an old veterinarian told me. It was that he was talking about drugs. He was talking about anesthetization drugs. And he was talking about there needs to be at least 3 degrees of separation between someone who shouldn't have the drugs and those drugs. Whether or not that's a locked door, a locked safe, and then being hidden away in a place that isn't readily seen to the eye. There are subtle degrees of separation and clear ones. A fence is a clear one, but the subtle ones might be even more important. When a person walks into the zoo, they are inundated with the reality that there are animals here that could do harm to them, and that there's a risk coming to the zoo. It's all over the place. There's no way that an adult, or even most reasonably rational kids, can come in and not be aware of that fact. There should be safeguards as far as guests concerned. It boggles my mind that a young boy was able to climb over a railing, walk through shrubs, stand on the ledge of a moat, and at the very least, some guest didn't grab that kid. I've seen situations where guests have stepped right in and said, "You're not doing the right thing." It usually happens. People know what's right and wrong, and people act. And that's an important relationships that guests have in the zoo. That's why we inundate them. But even so, as far as keepers are concerned, the connectivity between keepers, even ones working in different areas, is tremendous. If a person walks into a zoo and they're suspect, even at the point, it also boggles my mind how someone who is outwardly stating that they wanted to go in and they wanted to swim the gorillas got from the entrance of the zoo to the gorilla exhibit, to the ledge, to the moat, and no one said anything. No one saw anything. No one reported anything. If you see someone in a zoo and you're a zoo employee, whether you're security, maintenance, a zookeeper, an upper, higher level staff, and you see an individual who is even a little bit shifty, a little bit concerning, their parents don't seem to be watching them, you let the keepers know. You let the rest of the staff know. You make it known that there's someone in the park who's a concern, and you watch that individual. If they're leaving your area, you let the keeper in the next area know that they're coming into your area, to be on the lookout, to keep an eye on them. At all levels, there are safeguards in a zoo. It's inundated in staff. They inundate it to the guests as well. It's a culture thing, a true example of a culture thing. And that's why 99.99999, even greater than that percent of the time, nothing happens. Even though a fence is 3 feet high. Even though there's an area of just an area of shrubs between them and the moat. The moat itself, the visual of the moat, should be detracting enough. So that's why I say it's not necessarily about whether or not the enclosure failed. The structures failed that day. On a very real level, if we get to the point where we have to separate small children from being able to see animals eye to eye, with just the air separating them, the real air that they both breathe, and we have to put bars back up, or we have to have at least windows everywhere, that would be a crying shame. That's all I have to say about that. The second question Richard asks is, was the child in any danger? Specifically talking about once the child is in the exhibit, whether or not the behaviors exhibited by the male silverback gorilla actually constituted severe potential for the individual actually being killed by the animal. And did that justify the animal being killed as a result? Did it justify the animal being gunned down? What was going on? And he cites several videos of other gorillas who in the past, when individuals have fallen in the exhibit, what they've responded with. And in some cases, it's been positive. It's been maternal. It's been caring. It's been human in some ways. He even quotes the Jane Goodall Institute, and her response apparently was that it didn't seem like the individual was in as much harm as the keepers thought they were. Which is interesting because Jane Goodall and I share something. We were both inspired by the book Tarzan as far as pursuing a career in animal care. And one of the principal things that you learn in the book Tarzan, the realities that is revealed in that book, is what male gorillas are. And that they're a little bit of berserkers. And that there are times when a baby gorilla or a female can get in their way and they'll just tear through it with hands and teeth, and it's grisly, and animals do die. The rage is real. They are generally not caregivers. Baby gorillas, infant gorillas, can be in real danger when in the path of a male. I remember working at the zoo that had gorillas, and it was a concern when a mother left a baby unattended and a male interacted with them, because bad things can happen. They're very strong, and the babies are very weak, and they're not necessarily going to take care of that individual. So that concerns me. I mean, when you search Jane Goodall on the internet, I don't presume to be an expert on what she's done, but the first thing that comes up when you search Jane Goodall on gorilla is a picture of her with a chimp. And it interests me that she would actually comment and be critical of the keepers and stuff like that, knowing how long she's been in this business. But that's besides the point. One thing you should definitely know from observing animals is that animals are also very different, individual to individual, and that's significant. I remember there were 2 males at the zoo that I worked at, and they were very different. One was a little bit of an escape artist, and he was very shy. He didn't really interact with the guests as much. The other one was a little bit more ostentatious. One of his defining personality characteristics was that he had an interest in human women. He was apparently attracted to large human women. And there were times where at the end of the day, when the animals had to be brought into holding, that he would become transfixed on a young lady who was hanging out at the end of the day at the zoo, wanted to see the gorillas one more time. Sometimes they brought them in a little early. And gorillas are one of those animals that if they don't come in, you're staying until they come in, because they're too dangerous and too strong to go in with them and do anything about that. So in those situations, you have to have that awkward conversation where you have to kind of explain to them that they might want to move along. And that's very real. Whether or not one gorilla does one thing is not really an outsider's thing to generalize. The keepers know that animal. They know what's irregular for him. They know what's normal for him. The director of the zoo said the keepers felt like the gorilla was acting irregular. And that means that child is in danger. And that brings me to the point of one of the things that I had to do when I was first starting out as a keeper. I had to get firearms tested. Because that's a reality of being a zookeeper. You have to protect your guests. You can't expect a mother to bring her child to a zoo if she doesn't feel like your zoo is going to take care of her child if something goes awry. You have to make that hard decision. Who are you going to protect? The animal or your customer? You have to deal with the reality that something bad could very well happen, whether or not it's the animal's fault or not, and you have to make that the choice. You have to protect the customer. That's your duty as a keeper, is to protect the visitors there. And that's something you deal with. That's something that if you have to make that fateful decision, and you have a shotgun in your hand, and you have to pull that trigger, that's something you have to live with. And that's not something to take lightly, Richard. Does That's all I have to say about that as well. The last thing he talks about is, what are gorillas doing in Cincinnati again? What are they doing in a zoo? He questions zoos in general. And one of the things he talks about gorillas being taken out of the wild for zoos, which is not something that an AZA-accredited zoo like Cincinnati Zoo does. The gorilla captive breeding program is very highly regulated. Gorillas are moved around as far as what is a good genetic fit as far as breeding purposes. You don't just breed whatever you want. I remember the lions at the zoo that I used to be an intern at. A generic lion is a lion that exists within the zoo population that they can't pinpoint his entire genetic lineage back to the wild. When you have an animal like that, you don't know what kind of illnesses, what kind of genetic defects exist in his line, in his history, and that animal does not get bred. A program like the captive gorilla program is not going out in the wild and doing something unethical like taking gorillas out. It doesn't happen. It is not real. That is a completely uninformed thought. But then there's the other question. He talks about it as a negative light, animals in zoos. But I think it's only fair if you're going to talk about the negative things, the negative connotations of having animals in enclosures and having people gawk at them all day, and having the reality of that being an aspect of why they're there. You also need to present the pros that have come out of that. There are animals that have successfully been taken out of the wild when there's very few of them, and they would have died out, and they've bred in zoos and released back in the wild, and their numbers are doing better. One good example is the golden lion tamarin. The golden lion tamarin has been bred in many zoos, and they have adapted procedures for rearing these animals and developing behaviors and profiles that can actually be put out in the wild again. And they have been reintroduced successfully. Another example, and Richard, this is your Toronto Zoo talking here. Toronto Zoo is famous as one of the breeders of the black-footed ferret, which there were only 18 left at one point. That animal was in trouble. And humans made the conscious choice to take those animals out and breed them. And the black-footed ferret has rebounded. Your zoo in your city, Richard, the reaccredited Toronto Zoo, had a big hand in that. And on some level, I think we should be proud of that, whether you're vegan or non-vegan. That's a good example of humans doing something to help animals. That's a real example of humans making an impact for a wild creature. And that's something worth talking about as well. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you for listening. Like, share, subscribe. I'll probably make more videos on related topics. But that's all I have to say about Harambe the gorilla. Rest in peace, big fella.